Hello everyone, I'm JG. Welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm reviewing Mastodon's third album, Blood Mountain. Now before getting into this review, I just want to remind anyone who's new to the channel that throughout this entire month of March, I'm reviewing all of Mastodon's albums leading up to the release to their new album, Emperor of Sand. And if you want to see all the reviews of Mastodon albums that I've already done, there's going to be a playlist at the end of this video that you can click the link to and see all those reviews. And of course, I've got the other reviews I haven't done yet coming up in the future, of course leading up to Emperor of Sand, and then I'm reviewing that album. And after that, I plan on doing my top 10 Mastodon songs sometime in April, so stay tuned for that by subscribing down below. And without further ado, let's get right into this review. Now before getting into this album in detail, I just want to make a general statement concerning bands that change their sounds and how I could kind of safely say that lots of metal bands and rock bands even that have a change in sound oftentimes have difficulty reconnecting with their old fan base because, of course, changes in sound often result in alienating old fans, things like that, and things usually don't go too well for the band as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying that every band that changes their sound makes bad music, because lots of times I even like the new music that they make. I'm just talking about how they possibly alienate fans from this. I mean, I don't think that's a really arguable fact that they do lose fans as a result of changing their sound. But that's a risk that every band needs to take to kind of stay, new and inventive with their sound, kind of keeping things fresh, I guess you could say. And I feel like Blood Mountain is an example of this to a degree. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Mastodon, which you really should be familiar with Mastodon, of course, this was a sludge metal band that kind of formed in the early 2000s and released, before the release of this album, two albums that were well received. Of course, Leviathan, their second album, was considered by many to be a classic. Really praised that album. You check my review out of it, I really praised that album. And yeah, of course, where do you really go from an album like that, which many would consider to be a band's best? Well, Mastodon decided to kind of change things up a little with Blood Mountain. And by change things up, I mean start to move away slowly from those really sludgy elements and move more to the progressive metal elements that were present on their previous works, but not really, taking the center stage. Now, I consider Blood Mountain to kind of be an even mix of these traits, I guess you could say. Some tracks, of course, lean more towards the sludgy side, some lean more towards the progressive side, and there's some tracks that, of course, have elements of both. And I think that's one of the strong points of this album, that kind of being a transition album from, the heaviness of Leviathan to the progressive leaning Crack the Sky, it kind of takes some of the strong points from both albums and both kind of sounds and molds them into one great project. And when I said that this album was kind of like half Leviathan, half Crack the Sky, I didn't mean that in the sense that it sounds like those two albums had a baby or anything. This album stands on its own perfectly well, and it really shows with kind of the sound that this album makes for itself, and just kind of the atmosphere that it creates. Now, to kind of describe that atmosphere, I need to go into this album's concept and story a bit first. Mastodon's first four albums were based on different elemental concepts. Their first album, Remission, was loosely based around the element of fire. Their second album, Leviathan, was based around the element of water, being that it was based on the novel Moby Dick. Of course, the two kind of go hand in hand. And Blood Mountain, for those of you who may not be able to tell from the title, is based on Earth. And as a result of that, this album kind of has an earthy feeling, I guess you could say. I know that's kind of, it's Earth, it has an earthy feeling. That's not really descriptive, but it really kind of fits when you listen to it all the way through. And besides from that whole elemental concept, this album does have a narrative to it, or at least a loose narrative. And it's an original narrative this time. It's not based on a novel or anything like that. It's about a man who's going into this Blood Mountain, searching for the crystal skull, which is going to allow him the next step into human, I guess, evolution. And it's kind of describing all the things he sees while on this quest, I guess you could say. He kind of suffers from starvation and things. He hallucinates stuff as a result. He encounters strange creatures, and all this is kind of told through this album's tracks. And there's not like, when I said this was kind of a loose story, it's not that it goes like linear from this song ends up here and then the next song picks up right there with this part of the story that leads into this part of the story. It's more like this song describes this, and then this song describes this, and it's kind of its own little bubble, and you can kind of connect the dots however way you wish. This album truly does capture the theme of nature and like going out into a mountainous region and just kind of experiencing the nature and the trees and the mountain and everything like that, the creatures that surround you. It kind of captures that feeling into an album, which isn't something I've really heard before, but it's really cool kind of hearing it, and adding that whole kind of quest concept into it kind of creates this sort of epic hero kind of story that just becomes cool to listen to, and kind of cool to kind of form your own story around these points that they've kind of laid out for you. The first track on this album, The Wolf is Loose, is just the perfect way to begin this album in my opinion, because it really kind of shows off Mastodon's change in sound and what you're really getting here. It has more aggressive moments, the drums are of course furious, there's more harsh vocals on here. However, at the same time it does add some more clean vocals in. And overall in this project, there's a lot more clean vocals than what we see in Mastodon's previous works. Leviathan had a few tracks that had clean vocals, but here it's lots of tracks do. Lots of tracks kind of trade off between aggressive vocals and clean vocals, and some are just all clean vocals. It's an interesting change of pace, and quite frankly, I enjoy it, because I think that Brent Hinds and Troy Sanders, the vocalists for this band, are great clean vocalists and non-clean vocalists. They do a great job regardless of whether or not they're doing their growls and screams or they're doing their best singing voice. It's phenomenal regardless. Either way, back to The Wolf is Loose. I know I got sidetracked there, but I really do feel like I need to mention the vocalist, but The Wolf is Loose, it feels like the epic start to this hero's quest to search for the Crystal Skull. It's just kind of this aggressive leaning track that's really overall powerful, and I think a great way to start off this project. The second track, Crystal Skull, features Scott Kelly of Neurosis, who I mentioned before on my Leviathan review, has appeared on every Mastodon release as a guest feature since Leviathan, and Crystal Skull is his appearance on Blood Mountain, where he provides some more aggressive leaning vocals to an overall pretty good track. Now, Sleeping Giant, the third track, is where things really start to get interesting in my opinion. Now, this track kind of begins up with a long-winded instrumental part that really shows off the more progressive-leaning elements of this band. And I feel like this instrumental section at the beginning really just kind of reminds me of trekking up a mountain, in my opinion. Of course, Sleeping Giant here is referring to Blood Mountain itself, and kind of, I feel like based on the lyrics here, that it's kind of describing it as an inactive volcano, hence Sleeping Giant. It's sleeping because it's inactive, and the lyrics kind of allude to the fact that it's a volcano, of course. If you look at them, you might see that, but maybe I'm wrong. Overall, it does capture that feeling really well, and then the vocals come in. You've got some really powerful, clean vocals that have this really kind of epic feel to them, just describing the mountain and the scenery everywhere. Overall, that's kind of what I meant earlier by this album just pulls off that really being out in nature feel and kind of that epic story feel at the same time. It's just the way the vocals and lyrics are delivered, mixed with the instrumentals, that really gives it that progressive, awesome feel, I guess you could say. There are some more really cool progressive leading guitar parts on this album, such as the fourth track, Capillary and Crest, which overall, guitar-wise, is just one of the best guitar tracks that are on this album. Really not much else to say about it other than the guitars go crazy here, and it really does capture that more progressive leading side of Mastodon that would later be explored on Crack the Sky. And I also really like how Mastodon aren't afraid to dive into their own lore on this album, kind of creating a world for it with the track Circle of Sasquatch. Of course, Sasquatch is kind of a made-up creature they made up, kind of a mix of Cyclops and Sasquatch. Has one eye, can see into the future, and it warns the protagonist of this album about what's to come on his quest. And overall, I kind of like how they make up their own kind of creature. I think it's really cool. And I think things like Sasquatches, that's kind of like out in the woods, mysterious creatures, adding the extra layer of it being like this mystical creature that can see into the future really does add that kind of, epic quest vibe to this otherwise kind of like out in nature story. And overall, concerning the instrumental on the track, it's more aggressive leaning and kind of calls back to the earlier sound of Mastodon's projects, especially a good change of pace considering the previous two tracks were more progressive. Now, about halfway through this album, we get an instrumental track, Blade Catcher, and the previous two Mastodon albums had instrumental tracks as well, Elephant Man and Joseph Merrick, which I praised in my reviews of those albums, especially how they closed out the albums in a sort of mysterious or, just they're changing up what we'd previously seen on those albums. Now, we get the instrumental track on Blood Mountain halfway through the track listing, and overall it's very different from the previous instrumentals that we've seen from Mastodon. Now on to Colony of Birchmen, that features Josh Homme of Queens of the Stone Age, another one of my favorite bands. And overall, I feel like it's an appropriate time to mention that I love how Mastodon play around with vocals just throughout their entire career, especially on this album. They have the aggressive vocals, the clean vocals. They have two vocalists as it is in the band itself, both doing aggressive and clean vocals. And then you have the guest features, Scott Kelly, as I mentioned before, on Crystal Skull, and here we have Josh Homme, providing his more high-pitched vocals that are kind of creepy sounding. They remind me a lot of his vocals on the Queens of the Stone Age album Lullabies the Paralyzed that was released a year before Blood Mountain. This kind of feels like something that if there was any track on this album to go on Lullabies to Paralyze, this could be it. But away from the Queens of the Stone Age stuff, this track is also creepy, just in concept. Now, the protagonist is kind of hallucinating from what I assume is maybe dehydration or hunger, and they kind of see the forest around them, like, chasing after and consuming them. Of course, like, I'm not sure if maybe literally he encountered, like, tree people that are chasing after him. You know, we already had the Sasquatch, or a fictional character, and maybe that is the case, or maybe he's just hallucinating this entire thing. And overall, just the mood of the track is kind of creepy. You got those clean vocals that are really nice and just beautiful, and overall, it's a really nice track. Now, going through the rest of the tracks on this album, we get to see some more aggressive moments, some more clean-leaning moments, and I think this may be the point in the album, the track listing, where it starts to lose traction maybe a little bit, but not really a lot. I still do love all the tracks on this album. It's just, if there was one point in the album that I may consider the weak point, this may be it. The track This Mortal Soil also features some really progressive leaning guitar points at the beginning that I think are just really cool, and going throughout the track with, you know, the more clean vocals. Overall, it's one of the more catchy songs that I always find stuck in my head. Just, you know, good track. Now it's time for me to talk about the last track on the album, and possibly my favorite track, Pendulous Skin. And the reason why it's possibly my favorite is because it's just so different and kind of cool. It reminds me a lot of the instrumental tracks from the previous two albums. I know I mentioned before that there was a track that reminded me of those, and this is it. Because sonically speaking, it kind of reminds me of those in the sense that it's more relaxed, not really aggressive, more progressive leaning. However, this track is different in the fact that it has vocals. Of course, not making it an instrumental. But the vocals here are very different from anything else on this album and anything else in Mastodon's entire discography, because they're really kind of distorted and indecipherable. Just really, it reminds me a lot as if the protagonist, I believe the protagonist at this point may be dying actually on their quest, and it feels like these are his last moments. He's like kind of slipping into death, and as a result of that, the world is just kind of blurring around him, and everything kind of becomes indecipherable. I feel like this is kind of him at that moment. Of course, that's why his words, or I guess you could say, are kind of indecipherable. He's just slipping into death, and everything he's saying isn't understandable. And I also feel like it's important to mention that in the lyric booklet for this album, it doesn't include the lyrics for this track. Now, you can find them online, of course, but I feel like it's interesting that they left out the lyrics for this track. Just kind of going around that theme that you don't know what he's saying. It's just kind of how he's saying it. And how he's saying it is beautiful. It's just really this kind of creepy, yet at the same time beautiful moment on this album. Great way to close it out. As I said before, it feels like he's dying out there, and I know that sounds really like dark, but the way this track kind of presents it, it feels almost lighter at the same time. I know I said it was creepy, but at the same time it kind of feels like a burden has kind of been lifted off of his life, and that death has kind of been his savior here on his quest. I really don't know how I'd connect all these. I haven't dived into this album completely in terms of the story and how I would put everything together, but just kind of what I've gotten through listening to this album multiple times, of course, over the time I've been a Mastodon fan. I just kind of thought that Pendulous Skin was kind of his death, and that maybe, you know, his quest has kind of been relieved from him as he's dying, and that's kind of why this track is more relaxed, because he doesn't have to do it anymore, he's dead. On that happy note, I'm just really happy that Mastodon ended off their album in a bang. It's just a really interesting track. You know, maybe not everyone will like it, not everyone will get it, but if you do, maybe you'll understand the genius of this track like I do. Wow, I'm really starting to sound like one of those progressive metal snobs. But overall, this is a phenomenal record in my opinion. Probably my third favorite Mastodon release. Just overall, I love the concept of the album. I feel like it integrates the whole Earth element theme and the whole quest of the narrator after the Crystal Skull and the whole Blood Mountain theme really well. I love how they make a whole universe around it with, you know, the Sasquatch and the Birchman, the Crystal Skull, all this kind of stuff that they made up to go along with it. And it's not like they dive into like making this massive story or anything out of it. It's kind of like I said before, you can piece together the parts for yourself. And that's part of the beauty of this album in my opinion. You can kind of make it up in parts as you go along, kind of making your own narrative to it to an extent, of course. They kind of give you the outline. You can fill in the rest from there. And yeah, the tracks on here are all great. I love how they mix the aggressive and the less aggressive parts. It's just phenomenal pretty much. Can't recommend it more to you. If you're a fan of Mastodon, of course, you're probably familiar with this already. And if you're unfamiliar with Mastodon, this may not be a bad record to start you off with, as it introduces you to the more aggressive side and the less aggressive, more progressive side of Mastodon. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty good introductory point. And of course, I don't know anyone who may not like this. Of course, if you don't like aggressive music, you may not like parts of it, but overall, I think this album is something that could offer a song that anyone could like, whether it be the more aggressive leading tracks like Circle of Sasquatch or Crystal Skull, or the more, laid back kind of sounding tracks like Pendulous Skin, as I said before. Great album. I'm going to cut myself short there before I just rambling about how much I love this album and how much I love Pendulous Skin, because I could go on for hours about how I love Pendulous Skin. But yeah, thank you for watching this video, and of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're reviewing all the Mastodon albums, so if you're a fan of Mastodon, make sure to hit that like button so you don't miss out on those coming out in the future. And if you want to see those old Mastodon reviews I've already done, click the playlist at the end of this video to, see those, because, if you like this review, you'll probably like those. I reviewed Remission, Leviathan, and their collection of songs called the Mastodon. Thanks for watching this video. Leave a like, as I said before, comment if you got something to say. Don't forget to subscribe, of course, and stay golden. That's how I end all my videos. Yep.